A 38-year-old single father walked into the headquarters of a billion-dollar corporation wearing a faded janitor's uniform, and for 3 seconds, nobody in that glass lobby bothered to look at him twice. Nobody, except the young woman who ran the entire company. One glance was all it took to freeze her in place, and under her breath, barely audible, she whispered that it could not possibly be him. 7 years earlier, a stranger had pulled her from a burning wreck and vanished into the night before she ever learned his name. Now that same face stood in a lobby, applying to mop floors, and somewhere behind his tired eyes was a secret that had cost him everything he once had. Liam Blake had not always measured his life in mop buckets and double shifts. There had been a version of him, not so long ago, who wore tailored suits and carried a briefcase instead of a cleaning cart, who signed his name to reports that moved millions of dollars and shaped the futures of companies far larger than the one he was about to enter through its service door. That man was gone now, buried under 7 years of silence, and what remained was a widower raising an 8-year-old daughter named Emma in a cramped 2-bedroom apartment on the edge of the city, in a building where the elevator rattled and the radiator hissed through the night. He had sold nearly everything he owned after his wife passed, keeping only what mattered. A few photographs, his daughter's stuffed rabbit, and a folder of documents he never let anyone see. Every morning, Liam filled out another application. And every afternoon, another rejection letter found its way into his inbox. Or worse, no response came at all. His resume told a story that made hiring managers uneasy. A 7-year gap with no explanation. No references. No digital footprint, as though a man had simply stepped out of his own life and reappeared a stranger. Interviewers would glance at the blank years, then glance at him, and something in their expressions would shift from curiosity to caution. He never blamed them. He understood exactly how suspicious a silence like that could look to people who had never had to disappear to survive. What kept him standing through all of it was a small voice that greeted him every evening when he came home smelling of failure and cheap coffee. Emma would run to the door before he even got his shoes off, wrap her arms around his waist, and tell him that she did not need a big house or new toys, that she only needed him there, sitting across from her at dinner, tucking her in at night, being the one constant in a world that had already taken her mother away. Liam would kneel down, hold her face in his hands, and promise her that things were going to get better, even on nights when he did not fully believe it himself. It was on one of those ordinary evenings, scrolling through a stack of listings on a second-hand laptop with a cracked screen, that he found a posting for a janitorial position at Helios Global, one of the most powerful corporations in the country. The pay was modest but steady. The benefits included health coverage for both him and Emma, and the overnight shift meant he could walk her to school every morning and be home before she went to bed. There was no glamour in the job, no title that would impress anyone, but there was stability, and after 7 years of running from everything that had once defined him, stability felt like the closest thing to victory he could hope for. He submitted the application without much thought, expecting the same silence that had answered every other attempt, and was surprised when a callback came within days. He pressed his one good shirt, polished a pair of worn shoes, and stood outside the towering glass headquarters of Helios Global the following morning, staring up at a building that seemed to touch the clouds, a structure that represented everything he had once been part of and everything he had since lost. He took a breath, reminded himself that this was for Emma and nothing else, and walked through the revolving doors into a lobby that gleamed like polished ice, carrying nothing but a folder of paperwork and a past he intended to keep buried forever. Vanessa Healy had built her entire adult identity around control, and at 32 years old, she had become the youngest chief executive in the history of Helios Global, a woman who arrived before sunrise and left long after the cleaning crews began their rounds. On the morning Liam walked through the lobby doors, she was crossing that same floor on her way to a board meeting that would decide the direction of a merger worth hundreds of millions of dollars, her mind occupied with spreadsheets, projections, and the quiet political maneuvering of men who had underestimated her for years. She was not thinking about coincidence. She was not thinking about the past at all. Then she saw him, He was standing near the reception desk in a uniform 2 sizes too large, filling out a form with the unhurried patience of a man who had learned not to expect anything good from paperwork, and something about the tilt of his head, the particular way his jaw set when he concentrated, made the corporate lobby around Vanessa dissolve into static. For a moment, the assistants rushing past her, the elevators chiming, the low murmur of 100 conversations, all of it faded, replaced by the memory of a night 7 years earlier that she had spent every year since trying to forget, and every year since failing to forget at all. She had been 25 then, riding home from a business dinner on a rain-slicked bridge, when the driver lost control and the sport utility vehicle went through the guardrail, tumbling toward the black water below before catching against a support beam, suspended, burning, filling with smoke. She remembered the heat first, then the sound of metal groaning, then a pair of hands pulling her through a shattered window as flames climbed the dashboard behind them. She remembered being laid on the pavement, coughing, disoriented, looking up into a face she could barely make out through the smoke and the rain, a face that told her she was safe now, that help was coming, and then that face was gone before the ambulances arrived. Gone before she could ask his name. Gone before she could thank him for giving her a life she had spent 7 years trying to make worthy of that sacrifice. She had searched for him in the months that followed, hired investigators, offered rewards, combed through traffic camera footage that showed only a blur of a man walking away into the dark, but every trail went cold, every lead dissolved into nothing, until eventually she had accepted that, whoever he was, he did not want to be found. And yet, here he stood, 7 years later, in the lobby of her own company, filling out an application for a job that paid barely enough to survive on, and every instinct in her body told her this was not a coincidence at all. Not possible. She whispered to herself, so quietly that her assistant standing beside her had to lean in and ask if something was wrong. Vanessa only shook her head, unable to explain the tremor in her own voice, unable to look away from a man who had not yet noticed her standing there. She composed herself, the way she had trained herself to do in every boardroom for the last 7 years, straightened her shoulders, and walked into her meeting as though nothing extraordinary had just happened, though her mind remained fixed entirely on the stranger in the lobby. By the time the meeting ended, she had already made a decision. She summoned the head of human resources to her office, under the guise of reviewing new hires, and asked, with practiced casualness, about the man who had applied for the overnight janitorial position. She learned his name was Liam Blake. She learned almost nothing else. Because his file, she was told, was strangely thin, containing little more than a name, an address, and a signature. Vanessa sat alone after the meeting, staring at that thin file, and gave a quiet order to have his background quietly and thoroughly investigated, telling no one why, not even entirely certain herself what she expected to find. Liam started his new position on a Monday night, arriving an hour before his shift began and staying long after it ended, a habit that did not go unnoticed by the small crew of maintenance workers who had grown accustomed to employees doing exactly the minimum required and not a moment more. He learned every hallway of the building within his first week, memorized which lights flickered on the 14th floor, which supply closets ran short on paper towels by Thursday, and which elevator bank tended to stall during the evening rush. He helped a night security guard carry boxes without being asked, fixed a jammed printer in the finance department in under 2 minutes, and calmed a junior analyst who had locked herself out of a server room at midnight, with a presentation due the next morning. What no one could quite explain was how a man hired to empty trash bins and buff floors seemed to understand the building's security architecture with the fluency of someone who had designed it himself. One evening, an engineer named Mike Sanders found Liam quietly rerouting a malfunctioning badge reader outside the executive suite, adjusting wiring with the confident hands of a professional, rather than the fumbling guesswork of an amateur. Mike asked where he had learned to do that kind of work, half joking, half genuinely curious, and Liam only offered a faint smile and said that a person picks up strange skills over the years, before returning to his cart and moving on to the next floor. It was during one of his late rounds through the executive conference room, gathering abandoned coffee cups and wiping down the long glass table, that Liam noticed a folder left carelessly on a side counter. its edge poking out from beneath a stack of quarterly reports. He was not the type of man to pry into business that was not his own. 7 years of hiding had taught him the value of looking away, but a single line on the visible page caught his attention before he could stop himself. A transfer of funds routed through 3 shell accounts he recognized instantly as a structure designed to obscure its origin. His hands went still over the folder for a long moment. He had seen structures like that before, in another life, when uncovering exactly this kind of financial deception had been his entire profession, and something cold settled in his chest, as old instincts he had spent years trying to silence began stirring awake again. He memorized the account numbers without touching the folder, without leaving a single fingerprint out of place, and returned it to precisely the position he had found it, then finished his rounds as though nothing at all had happened, carrying the information home in his memory the way another man might carry a splinter buried too deep to safely remove. Vanessa, watching the building's internal security feeds from her office late that same night, more out of habit than suspicion, saw the new janitor pause at that counter for exactly 4 seconds longer than any task required, saw his posture shift in a way that struck her as deliberate, rather than idle. She rewound the footage twice, studying the way he held himself, the alertness in a man who was supposed to be nothing more than invisible labor, moving quietly through her building after hours. The more she watched him work over the following days, correcting problems before anyone else noticed them, avoiding cameras with an ease that seemed almost practiced, the more certain she became that Liam Blake was not simply a man who had fallen on hard times. Vanessa's private investigation into Liam's past yielded almost nothing, and the emptiness of it troubled her more than any damaging discovery could have. There were no employment records before the last few months, no university transcripts, no social media presence, not even a parking ticket or a library card to suggest he had existed publicly at all during the previous 7 years. It was as though someone had reached into the world and carefully erased every trace of a man who had once been there, leaving behind only the shell of a person who now mopped floors after midnight. She reached out quietly to a retired detective who had once done contract security work for the company, a weathered man named Frank Dolan, who had spent 30 years learning to read the kind of silence that surrounded certain people, the silence of witnesses in protection, of men who had made powerful enemies, of people who had simply decided that vanishing was safer than staying visible. Frank looked over the sparse file Vanessa handed him, studied the 7-year gap, and told her plainly that in his experience, a person did not disappear that thoroughly by accident. Someone like this, he said, chooses to disappear, or is forced to. The truth, buried far deeper than either of them yet realized, traced back to a version of Liam Blake that had existed a decade earlier, a sharp, meticulous financial investigator who had built a reputation for uncovering fraud that others were too intimidated or too compromised to touch. He had been assigned to audit a mid-sized investment firm that, on paper, appeared entirely legitimate, until he began noticing patterns in the transaction records that reminded him of the same shell account structures he would later recognize in that conference room folder at Helios Global. He had spent months quietly building a case, certain he was on the verge of exposing a fraud worth billions, certain that his diligence would be rewarded rather than punished. Instead, before he could present his findings, the men behind the scheme moved first. Evidence was planted, suggesting that Liam himself had been the one manipulating the accounts. Doctored records appeared overnight. Colleagues he trusted suddenly refused to meet his eyes, and within weeks he had been stripped of his position, his reputation, and his ability to find work anywhere in his field ever again. The scandal followed him like a shadow, and the stress of it, the humiliation, the sleepless nights spent trying to clear a name that no one wanted to hear defended, wore down his wife's fragile heart until it simply gave out one winter morning while Emma slept in the next room. Liam buried his wife, packed what little remained of their life into 2 suitcases, and left the city with his daughter. Before anyone could ask him another question he no longer had the strength to answer. He told himself he was protecting Emma from a world that had already proven how easily it could destroy an innocent man. And for 7 years, he kept every promise of that new, quieter life, until fate placed him back inside the very kind of corporate machinery that had once torn everything from him, standing this time not as an investigator with a badge and a mandate, but as a janitor with a mop and a memory that refused to stay buried. The shell accounts Liam had noticed were only the surface of something far larger moving beneath the polished floors of Helios Global, a conspiracy that Vanessa began uncovering piece by piece as she dug deeper into contracts that no longer made sense and investments that seemed to serve no one's interest but a small circle of trusted board members. Chief among them was Richard Thornton, the company's longtime chief financial officer, a man who had helped the founder build Helios from a modest startup into a global giant and who wore that history like armor against suspicion. Vanessa had trusted him since her earliest days in the company, which was precisely what made the pattern she was uncovering so difficult to accept. Contracts were being awarded to vendors with no verifiable history. Invoices were inflated by amounts too small to trigger automatic review, but too consistent to be coincidence. And shares were being quietly repositioned in ways that would benefit a handful of insiders if the merger currently under negotiation collapsed under manufactured suspicion. Someone inside the company was feeding information to a rival firm. Someone was manipulating the very deal that was supposed to secure the company's future, and Vanessa realized with a chill that whoever it was had access to rooms and documents that only the most trusted executives could reach. Liam, moving unnoticed through hallways and offices in the quiet hours when the building belonged only to cleaning crews and security guards, overheard more than anyone realized a janitor could. Late one night, passing near a private office with its door left slightly ajar, he heard Richard Thornton's voice, low and controlled, discussing numbers with someone on the phone in a tone that carried the particular coldness of a man accustomed to erasing inconvenient obstacles. The rhythm of that conversation, the careful evasiveness, the deliberate vagueness about names and accounts, struck Liam with a familiarity that made his chest tighten because he had heard men speak exactly that way once before, in the final weeks before his own life had been dismantled. He recognized the architecture of the scheme almost immediately, the same layered deception, the same use of shell structures to obscure a paper trail, the same practiced innocence men like Thornton wore in public, while quietly bleeding a company from the inside. Liam stood frozen in the hallway for a long moment, torn between the instinct to walk away and protect the fragile peace he had built for Emma, and the old, stubborn part of himself that had never fully accepted being silenced 7 years earlier. He thought of his daughter's face, of the promise he had made never to let danger touch her again, and yet he also thought of every innocent employee at Helios who had no idea their livelihoods were being gambled away by men who would never personally suffer the consequences. That night, walking home through empty streets under a sky heavy with the threat of rain, Liam made a decision he had sworn he would never make again. He would not confront anyone, not yet, and he would not risk his family for a company that owed him nothing. But he would watch, and he would remember, and quietly, methodically, in the same disciplined way he once built cases that powerful men had tried and failed to bury, he would begin gathering the truth, not for Helios Global, and not even entirely for Vanessa Healy, but for the simple, stubborn belief that his daughter deserved a father who had not spent his entire life running. Vanessa could no longer pretend the strange janitor in her building was simply a man in need of a job, and one evening, long after the offices had emptied, and only the hum of the air conditioning filled the executive floor, she found him alone in the break room, quietly wiping down a counter that did not particularly need cleaning. She closed the door behind her, an act that made Liam's shoulders tense just slightly before he set down his cloth and turned to face her directly for the first time since he had started working there. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Two people separated by wealth and title, and 7 years of silence, yet bound together by a single burning night on a rain-soaked bridge. "Why did you save me?" she finally asked, her voice steadier than she expected it to be, though her hands were not. Liam studied her for a moment, as though deciding how much of the truth she deserved, and answered simply that in that moment she had needed saving, and he happened to be the person standing close enough to do it. Nothing more complicated than that. She pressed further, asking why he had disappeared afterward, why he had refused every attempt she made to find him and thank him properly. And his answer came quieter this time, heavier, carrying the weight of everything he had never told another living soul outside his daughter. He told her that he had not wanted to be found, Because being found meant being known, and being known, at that particular point in his life, was the most dangerous thing that could happen to him or to anyone standing near him. He did not explain further, not that night, but something in the rawness of his voice convinced Vanessa that his reasons had nothing to do with modesty and everything to do with survival. She felt tears rise unexpectedly, 7 years of gratitude and confusion and unanswered questions, finally finding somewhere to land, and she did not bother hiding them from him the way she hid every other emotion from everyone else in that building. "I searched for you for years," she admitted, her voice breaking slightly. "I hired investigators. I offered rewards. I needed to know that the person who gave me my life back was safe, was well, was somewhere out there living a good life because of what he did for me." Liam's expression softened at that, something old and tired shifting behind his eyes, and he told her gently that if she had known who he truly was back then, known the accusations that trailed behind his name like smoke, she might have chosen to stay far away from him instead of searching for years to find him. Vanessa shook her head firmly, insisting that nothing he could tell her about his past would change what he had done for her on that bridge, that courage like his did not come from ordinary men, and that whatever had happened to drive him into hiding, she refused to believe he was the villain in that story. Something shifted quietly between them in that break room. Not romance yet. Not trust fully earned. But the first fragile thread of understanding between two people who had both learned, in very different ways, how easily the world could destroy someone who had done nothing wrong. Liam did not tell her everything that night, but for the first time in 7 years, he allowed himself to believe that perhaps, with the right person standing beside him, the truth would not have to remain buried forever. With Vanessa's trust now cautiously extended toward him, Liam began working in the shadows of Helios Global, with a purpose sharper than mere survival, quietly compiling the evidence that would eventually unravel Richard Thornton's carefully constructed scheme. He moved through the building at night, with the calm precision of a man who had once built entire cases from nothing but patience and attention to detail. Photographing documents left carelessly on desks, noting patterns in access logs that showed Thornton entering restricted financial systems at hours no legitimate business required, and cross-referencing vendor names against public records that revealed shell companies registered to addresses that did not exist. He brought what he found, not to the police, not yet, but to Vanessa directly. Meeting her in the quiet hours after midnight in her office, when the rest of the executive floor stood empty. Together they expanded their small circle of trust to include Susan Reyes, the company's sharp and fiercely principled head of legal affairs, and an internal auditor named David Whitfield, both of whom had independently noticed irregularities in the numbers, but lacked the full picture Liam had begun to assemble. The four of them worked in careful secrecy, aware that a single misstep, a single suspicious glance from the wrong person, could alert Thornton and his allies before enough evidence had been gathered to make an accusation stick. Word of quiet inquiries traveled faster than any of them anticipated, and within days, Thornton's allies inside the company grew visibly nervous, their conversations in hallways falling silent whenever Liam's cart rolled past, their eyes lingering on him a moment too long. It did not take long for suspicion to curdle into retaliation. Liam arrived for his shift one evening to find security waiting for him at the entrance, informing him coldly that he was being detained on suspicion of stealing company property. Specifically, a laptop reported missing from an executive office that Liam had, according to falsified access logs, entered without authorization the previous night. He remained calm, even as they searched his locker, even as whispers spread through the maintenance staff that the strange new janitor had turned out to be exactly the kind of thief everyone should have suspected from the beginning. He understood immediately what was happening, recognizing the maneuver from the same playbook that had been used against him 7 years earlier, manufactured evidence designed to discredit an inconvenient witness before he could speak a single incriminating word aloud. What Thornton's people did not know, however, was that Liam had learned from his previous downfall never again to rely on a single source of proof. While the falsified footage from the main security system conveniently showed him entering the executive office at the precise time in question, Liam knew from his earlier work fixing the building's badge readers that a secondary, older backup camera system remained active in a maintenance closet down the corridor, a system so outdated that whoever had staged the false evidence had clearly forgotten it existed. Quietly, without raising alarm, he informed Vanessa of its location, and as security prepared to escort him from the building in disgrace, a slow, steady confidence settled over him. The quiet certainty of a man who had once lost everything to a lie, and did not intend to lose everything to one twice. The shareholder meeting had been scheduled for weeks, intended as a routine formality to finalize the merger that would determine the company's future. But by the morning it finally arrived, the atmosphere inside the grand conference hall crackled with a tension few in attendance could name. Richard Thornton stood near the podium in a tailored suit, composed and confident, prepared to present a narrative he had spent months constructing, one in which financial irregularities uncovered during the merger review would be quietly attributed to reckless decisions made by Vanessa herself, positioning him as the steady hand needed to save the company from its young, inexperienced chief executive. He began his presentation smoothly, citing selectively chosen figures, casting doubt on Vanessa's judgment in a tone that sounded reasonable to anyone unfamiliar with the truth hidden beneath his carefully rehearsed words. Board members shifted in their seats, murmurs rippling through the crowd of shareholders, and for a moment it seemed as though his strategy might succeed exactly as planned, transferring blame onto the one person who had actually been fighting to protect the company from collapse. Vanessa sat perfectly still at the head of the table, her expression unreadable, waiting for the signal they had all agreed upon the night before. Then the doors at the back of the hall opened, and Liam Blake walked in. No longer wearing his janitor's uniform but a simple dark suit that Susan Reyes had insisted he wear for exactly this moment, carrying a laptop connected to the room's main display. A murmur of confusion swept through the crowd as recognition dawned slowly on faces that had walked past him in hallways for weeks without a second glance, and Thornton's composed expression cracked for just an instant before he forced it back into place, demanding to know what this man was doing, interrupting a shareholder meeting. Liam said nothing in response, simply nodding toward David Whitfield, who activated the display screen behind the podium, filling it with the footage recovered from the forgotten backup camera, timestamps clearly proving that Liam had never entered the executive office the night in question, followed immediately by financial records, tracing the shell accounts directly back to accounts under Thornton's personal control, and finally, damning recordings of phone conversations in which Thornton could be heard coordinating with an outside firm to sabotage the merger for personal profit. Gasps rippled through the hall as the truth unfolded across the screen in irrefutable detail, board members turning to stare at the man they had trusted for decades, with expressions caught somewhere between disbelief and dawning horror. Detective Frank Dolan, who had been quietly waiting near a side entrance with two uniformed officers, stepped forward the moment the final piece of evidence appeared on screen, moving calmly through the stunned crowd toward Thornton, who had gone pale and silent, all his practiced confidence collapsing at once. As officers led him from the hall in handcuffs past a room full of shareholders who had, moments earlier, been prepared to believe every word out of his mouth, Vanessa finally rose from her chair and turned to look at Liam. Standing quietly near the podium, with the same calm expression he wore every night, while mopping floors that most people never even noticed him cleaning. In that instant, an entire company came to understand that the man they had walked past without a glance had just saved every job, every investment, and every future that Helios Global represented. In the days that followed the shareholder meeting, the story of what had happened spread far beyond the walls of Helios Global, and with it came the reopening of a case that had been closed and forgotten for 7 long years. Detective Frank Dolan, having personally witnessed the sharpness of mind and depth of evidence Liam had assembled against Thornton, took a particular interest in the strange gap in his background and pulled the old fraud case files from the archive himself, curious whether the same man's misfortune years earlier might share more in common with recent events than anyone had previously suspected. What Frank found, after weeks of careful cross-referencing, confirmed exactly what Liam had known all along but had never been able to prove, that the fraudulent evidence used to destroy his career a decade earlier bore the same distinctive fingerprints, the same shell account architecture, the same layered deception, As the scheme, Thornton had just been arrested for attempting at Helios Global. It became increasingly clear that Thornton had learned his methods, or perhaps even collaborated directly with the very people who had orchestrated Liam's downfall years before. Two chapters of the same long, quiet crime, finally connecting across a decade of silence. With new evidence in hand, prosecutors reopened Liam's original case, and within weeks, the charges that had haunted him for 7 years were formally and publicly dismissed. His name cleared in the same courtrooms that had once refused to hear his defense. News outlets that had barely acknowledged his existence when he was falsely accused now ran his story prominently, describing him not as a disgraced former investigator but as the quiet hero who had single-handedly exposed a conspiracy large enough to threaten one of the country's largest corporations. Emma, watching the evening broadcast from their small apartment with wide, disbelieving eyes, saw her father's face appear on the screen for the first time in her young life, not as the tired man who came home smelling of floor cleaner, but as someone the entire nation was suddenly calling a hero. She turned to look at him sitting beside her on the worn couch, and without a word, threw her arms around his neck, holding him tightly as though she could somehow press 7 years of quiet suffering out of his body through sheer force of love. "Dad," she whispered against his shoulder, "everyone finally knows you're a good person." And Liam held her close, feeling something loosen in his chest that had been tightly wound since the day he buried his wife, and fled the city with nothing but a suitcase and a frightened little girl. At Helios Global, Vanessa stood before the entire company during an all-staff gathering held in the same grand hall where Thornton had once tried to destroy her reputation, and publicly thanked Liam not only for saving the company from financial ruin, but for reminding everyone in that room what genuine integrity looked like when it was tested under the harshest possible conditions. As she spoke, employees who had walked past him in hallways for weeks, barely registering his presence, rose to their feet in a standing ovation that seemed to shake the very windows of the building. And somewhere in that thunderous applause, the quiet janitor who had once been invisible became, almost overnight, a symbol of everything decent that still remained possible in a world that so often rewarded deception over honesty. Weeks after the truth had settled, and the initial storm of headlines had quieted into something more like respect, Vanessa called Liam into her office and offered him a position that would have seemed unthinkable only a month earlier, the role of Chief Risk and Integrity Officer for the entire corporation. A seat at the very table where decisions were made that shaped thousands of lives. She explained that no one else in the company possessed his particular combination of investigative sharpness, quiet discipline, and unshakable moral clarity, qualities that could not simply be taught or hired for, and that Helios Global needed exactly that kind of person watching over its future, if it hoped to avoid ever repeating Thornton's betrayal. Liam declined immediately, gently but firmly, explaining that he had spent 7 years building a quiet, careful life for his daughter, and the idea of stepping back into the kind of high-profile, high-pressure position that had once cost him everything filled him with a hesitation he could not easily shake. He told Vanessa that he was grateful, deeply grateful, for the chance she had given him simply to clean floors and rebuild some measure of dignity, but that trading a mop for a boardroom seat felt like inviting the same kind of danger back into Emma's life that he had spent years trying to protect her from. Vanessa did not push immediately, understanding the particular weight of fear that came from having already lost everything once before. But over the following weeks, she found small, patient ways to make her case, showing him the concrete changes his evidence had already brought about. The new transparency measures being implemented across every department, the employees who now felt safe, reporting irregularities they had previously been too frightened to mention. Liam began to see that his caution, understandable as it was, might also be denying countless other families the same protection his own daughter now enjoyed. Eventually he agreed, but only under conditions he insisted upon without compromise: that his schedule would always accommodate time with Emma, without exception, that he would receive no special privileges or preferential treatment beyond what the role itself required, and that he would begin, symbolically at least, exactly where he had started, walking the same floors, greeting the same maintenance crew who had once been his only colleagues, never forgetting the perspective he had gained from being the most overlooked person in the building. A year passed, and under the combined leadership of Vanessa's vision and Liam's unwavering integrity, Helios Global transformed into an organization widely regarded across the industry as the gold standard for corporate transparency. Its internal reporting systems, studied and imitated by competitors who had once dismissed such measures as unnecessary overhead. Emma, meanwhile, grew steadily into a confident, cheerful child who no longer flinched at the mention of money troubles, attending a good school, sleeping soundly through nights that were no longer haunted by her father's quiet worry. Secure, her father would always be there waiting for her at the end of the day, exactly as he had promised on every difficult night that came before. Between Vanessa and Liam, something had grown slowly and carefully in the space between gratitude and understanding. Not the rushed passion of a fairy tale, but the patient, deliberate trust of two people who had each survived their own private catastrophe and recognized in the other a rare kind of resilience. They did not rush toward romance, choosing instead long conversations over quiet dinners, an easy comfort built one honest exchange at a time, each of them learning that real trust could not be purchased with wealth or granted by title. Only earned slowly, the same way integrity itself had to be proven again and again until it became simply who a person was. On the evening of the company's annual employee appreciation ceremony, held in the same grand hall where Thornton had once tried and failed to destroy the truth, Vanessa stood at the podium, before a room filled with employees, executives, and reporters who had come to witness the culmination of a story that had captured the public's imagination for months. She called Liam up to the stage, and with a warm, genuine smile that had nothing rehearsed about it, presented him with a new nameplate for his office door, one that no longer read Janitor, but instead, in simple engraved letters, declared him Chief Integrity Officer of Helios Global. Emma, sitting in the front row beside an empty seat that had been saved just for this moment, could not contain herself any longer and ran up onto the stage, wrapping her small arms around both her father and Vanessa at once, laughing with the pure, uncomplicated joy of a child who finally understood, fully and completely, that her family's hardest days were behind them. The hall erupted into applause that seemed to go on and on. Employees rising to their feet, cameras flashing, a company and a community celebrating not merely the recovery of lost fortunes, but the quiet, hard-won triumph of a man who had once lost absolutely everything, and, through sheer integrity, patience, and love for his daughter, had found his way back to a life and a family worth every sacrifice it had taken to reach it. Long after the applause had faded and the hall had emptied of reporters and cameras, Liam stood alone for a moment, near the tall windows overlooking the city, the same skyline he had once stared up at from the sidewalk outside, wondering if he would ever be allowed back into a room like this one. He thought of the version of himself who had walked through those revolving doors in a uniform 2 sizes too large, carrying nothing but a folder of paperwork and a past he had been certain would remain buried forever. And he found it strange, in a quiet and grateful way, how completely that version of him had been transformed, without ever once betraying who he truly was underneath it all. He had not changed to earn his place in that building. He had simply been seen, finally, for exactly who he had always been. Emma found him there by the window a few minutes later, tugging gently at his sleeve, the way she used to when she was small enough to be carried, and asked him if they could go home now, because she was tired, and because, she added with a sleepy smile, home was the only place in the world she ever really wanted to be, as long as he was there with her. Liam knelt down, the way he always had, and told her that home was not a place at all. Not really. It had never been the cramped apartment with the rattling elevator, or the glass tower with his name now printed on a door. It had always simply been the two of them, together. No matter how little or how much they had, Vanessa watched them from across the room, a quiet warmth settling behind her eyes, understanding at last that some of the richest men in that building had spent their entire lives chasing something the janitor had carried with him the whole time, without ever needing to say a single word about it. Outside, the city lights stretched endlessly beneath a clear night sky, And as father and daughter walked hand in hand out through the same revolving doors he had once entered as a stranger, no one thought worth a second glance. Liam allowed himself, for the first time in 7 long years, to simply feel proud, not of the title on his door or the story now told about him on every screen in the country, but of the quiet, unshakable love that had carried him through every single dark night it had taken to finally reach this one.